In the nuanced world of offensive line scouting, raw power, foot speed, and technique often dominate the discussion. But when projecting success at the NFL level, there's an underrated trait that can be the difference between a tackle who merely survives and one who dominates. This would be interior functional reach, or how far a lineman can actually strike forward with control, balance, and power. Most draft analysts obsess over arm length and wingspan as standalone metrics, but these only scratch the surface. In reality, the geometry of a lineman's upper body, particularly the relationship between their arm length and shoulder width, is far more revealing predictor of trench success than one might believe, because these are things the player cannot adjust. It's who they are. Now, it's interesting to hear people go from Will Campbell's arms being too short, then to finding out his arms were longer in reality than reported at the combine. Then they had to move on to, the wingspan. But no one can really tell you why that's a measurement that means anything for an offensive lineman in the modern NFL, where you shouldn't be striking outside your frame, but it's more about inside your frame. So in front of you, inside the shoulders. But it seems like people are still missing some of my points made in previous videos. Now, I've addressed these concerns before, but it seems like people are still missing some of my points made in those previous videos. Yes, arm length matters, but their interior functional reach is going to be superior because it determines if the athlete can actually utilize their anatomical length. Yes, they do measure wingspan, but it doesn't have the same weight for a lineman as other positions. Somebody that has to cover an area or be a target. So like a defensive back or a linebacker or a wide receiver. It's more important for an offensive lineman to have good technique, good footwork, strike timing, momentum, force production, etc. These have much greater correlation to offensive line play than having your arm stretch out to your side. Now, that doesn't make the measurement completely useless for offensive linemen, because you can derive shoulder width from the player's wingspan and minus the sum of their two arms, which is used to help determine the functional reach and some important ratios to help decide whether a player is best suited for tackle or the interior. Using this lens, Will Campbell still emerges as a clear standout offensive lineman amongst his peers. His proportions actually make the most biomechanically efficient strike triangle of any tackle prospect we have studied this year, and when visualized, his forward reach still allows him to play at an NFL level. So in my arm discrepancy video, which I posted the day after the NFL Combine, I point out that the measurements were off for a lot of players, not just linemen, but overall. I also discussed how players' functional reach is more important than just the anatomical reach, or just the simple arm measurement. I talked about how scapular protraction, shoulder width, and a few other factors can impact if a player can use their arm effectively, and what is their actual reach forward. Because your arm length is not the only measurement that determines how far your two-handed punch reaches for the strike point. To understand what I'm talking about, we need to get into some math. So imagine the upper body of an offensive lineman in a symmetrical stance, right? So you're looking like a top-down view, as if, like say a drone was looking down, hovering over a tackle, right? So you're looking right down, all you can see is basically their helmet, top of their helmet, their shoulder pads, and their arms, and that's basically all you can see, right? So the base of the triangle that we're talking about would be essentially the shoulder width, right? So essentially the length of their shoulder pads, which we can approximate as wingspan minus 2 times their arm length, right? So you take their wingspan, you minus the 2 arm lengths, the difference there is going to be basically their shoulder width. That should tell us the base of the triangle, right? Now, the legs of the triangle, which would be for an isosceles triangle, the other 2 sides of the triangle. If you're looking this in a classic pyramid position, the base of the pyramid would be the player's shoulder width, right? And then the sides of the pyramid would be their arms. And the very top, the apex, is where we're kind of saying where the strike point will be for a two-handed punch. Now, obviously, it's not put together, but in order for to talk about this with math, we're going to use that because hopefully the real strike is only a few inches apart, right? Now the height of the triangle, or a height of the pyramid, in this case, is extending from the midpoint of the shoulder line. So middle of the chest, right? That's going to be from that to the apex where the hands punch, right? So the strike point, right? The furthest point away from that player, strike point in the middle, right to the middle of their chest, right? That's really the height of the triangle. That's really going to help determine what is like your anterior functional reach. Now, there's other things involved, scapular protraction, a few other things, but let's go with that for today, right? Just so we get an idea. This metric can tell us how far forward a lineman can strike, how efficient the strike can be biomechanically, and how fast and stable the lineman can engage the defender. Because a lineman should have a tight punch, as we talked about before, right on the breastplate, tight arms to prevent the defender from getting inside the frame. So tight, straight on, forceful, efficient. It doesn't compromise the athlete. Now we're talking about that strike triangle and the math that's going to go along with this. Now, if we apply this to the top tactical prospects, it's going to be interesting because although Campbell doesn't have the longest arms, he still has a strong functional reach based upon these measurements. Now, Campbell, 33 inches for the arm length, wingspan 77 and a quarter, which would give us a shoulder width of around 11 and a quarter. That gives you a functional reach of around 32 and a half inches. Well, that's important because Campbell's only losing roughly half an inch of functional reach as they move towards the middle, giving him the most forward-oriented punch, essentially, out of any offensive line we modeled. You're having a really good arm-to-shoulder ratio. His arms are almost 3 times longer than his shoulder width, so this allows him to keep his hands inside the frame while delivering fast, controlled strikes that neutralize defenders before they can win outside leverage. And we see this on tape. Now, comparing to the field, the interesting one, which going into the season, and I still think this guy is a solid first-round talent, we take Kelvin Banks Jr., who has roughly 33 and a half inch arms, so longer arms than Will Campbell. Oh, and his wingspan is over 84 inches. So longer arms, much bigger wingspan. That's giving him a shoulder width of like 17 and a third, but yet his functional reach is only 32 and roughly a third. So how is Kelvin Banks, with somebody who has longer arms and a bigger wingspan, have a shorter functional reach? Because if we're going back to the math, the 33 and a half inch arm length is going to give you, again, the legs of the triangle, the shoulder width of roughly 17 and a third inches. Now, why does that work out? Well, when you have such broad shoulders, your arm has to move further into the midline, which shortens up the height of the triangle. Talking about with anterior reach. Because Kelvin Banks is so wide and he's striking in, he's actually losing some of that arm length because of how broad he is. See, that's what people are missing, is that when you're talking about guards and tackles, yeah, arm length, like actual anatomical arm length matters because, yes, you're doing the arms battle versus long arm defenders, but at the same time, it's not the whole story. You also have to consider how broad the player's shoulders are. You can have long arms, but if you have really broad shoulders, you're built like a guard. Now, I'm not saying Kelvin Banks has to be shoved in inside, because he's not that bad in terms of functional reach. He has long arms. But if we're talking about anybody who's quote-unquote a guard, at this point, it's more likely to be Kelvin Banks. Now, Josh Simmons, he had, 34 and 1/8, I believe, for his arm length. His wingspan was like 82. So we're getting a shoulder width of 13 and 3/4 of an inch, which gave you a functional reach of roughly 33, just under 33 and a half inches. Ozzy, 33 and a half inch arm length, wingspan 81 and a quarter. That gave you a shoulder width of 14 and a quarter, functional reach 27 and roughly 3/4 of an inch. Now Charles Grant, nearly 35 inch arm length, wingspan was estimated to be 82 and a half. That gave us 34 and a third inch functional reach. So that's the best so far. Donovan Jackson, Interesting one to look at. Donovan Jackson, 33.5-inch arms, so longer than Campbell's, right? 83-inch wingspan. Now his functional reach is 32.5. Huh. Just as good as Will Campbell's. Josh Connerly had a good one too. His is 34-inch arms, wingspan around 81. His functional reach was just under 33.5 inches. Now I'm talking about arm to base ratios. Campbell is supreme. He has 2.93 arm to shoulder width ratio. Now looking at arm to shoulder width ratio, Campbell's supreme. He's got 2.93 there. Next would be Charles Grant at 2.74. Then Connerly at 2.62. After that, Simmons at 2.48. Ozzie 2.35. Donovan Jackson at 2.09. And then Kelvin Banks coming in at 1.93. Anything under 2 almost puts you in as a guard prototype. Now, arm to reach ratio, Will Campbell, 1.02. Josh Simmons, the same. Charles Grant, the same. Connerly, the same. Ozzie Trapillo, the same. Now, Donovan Jackson, 1.03, and Kelvin Banks, 1.04. You want to get close to 1, but notably, Will Campbell is at the same level as Simmons, Grant, Connerly, and Trapillo. So the proportions for Will Campbell support him to be a tackle, but yet his arm to base ratio tells you that he's going to be much more forceful. That force transfer during offensive line punch is significantly influenced by the angle at which the hands engage the defender. A narrower shoulder width allows for a more direct linear punch, maximizing force transfer. Conversely, wider shoulders can cause the hands to approach from a wider angle, potentially reducing the efficiency of the force applied because it's coming from more of a grazing angle. For instance, Will Campbell, with a shoulder width of 11.25 inches and an arm length of 33, has an arm to base ratio of 2.93. This configuration allows him to have a nearly straight-on punch, optimizing force transfer, whereas you take Kelvin Banks, his shoulder width that's over 17.3 inches with roughly the same arm length has an arm to base ratio of 1.93, indicating a wider punch angle and potentially a less efficient force transfer. Now, again, wider shoulders can provide advantages in certain blocking scenarios, such as a reach or lateral movements. That's important, I'll give you that. But they also may compromise the directness and efficiency of the force application on straight-on engagements, which is what you're looking for from tackles. Should have his footwork good enough that he's actually straight in front of his defender. I mean, if he's losing the rep, I guess, yeah, maybe wider, like having a massive wingspan, you can put a hand on some guy and hold him and get a flag. But there's no weight behind that. It's not like he's catching a ball. Like, you take a wide receiver, you're like, you want him to be a big target, right? So his arm can be, 360, he's covering a huge target. You want that because you're stopping a ball. Not a 300-pound defensive lineman coming directly at that hand and just swiping it right out of the way. You have to sometimes think about if things actually matter on the field. Where do we want to talk about anterior functional reach? Of course. And it's not just about the geometry we just went through. It's about the real reps. The real reps under pressure. Campbell rarely oversets because he doesn't need extra steps to time his punch. He's got that efficient punch. He doesn't reach. Barely see him lunge. Rarely see him lose balance. The hallmark of players with poor frontal reach. Some of these other guys that have bad frontal reaches, yeah, they slip off. They mistime their punches, and they almost fall flat in their face. Whereas Will Campbell, his strikes land fast, compact. They're letting him control speed rushers without opening his hips. And on film, this manifests in clean, repeatable wins against SEC caliber edge defenders, and few tackles can punch while staying square and consistently as Campbell does. And just a reminder, as far as my tally right now is that there are 12 NFL defenders that Will Campbell has faced in his first 2 years, and there's several more that he faced this past year that will be in the NFL this year, and there's probably a few guys in a couple years they face this year that will be in the NFL. Almost every weekend, that guy is playing against NFL caliber players. Reminder, LSU has had a top 10 strength of schedule all 3 years. No other tackle in this draft class can say these things. Has these on their profile. Yeah, like Armand Membu. I think he's got 8 guys that he's measured. And I mean, this last season, I think they were in the high 50s for strength of schedule. So there's things to consider when you're looking at the full profile. And, Armand Membu with his arm length, which was like 33.5, and he had like 82-inch wingspan, that puts him essentially in the same realm as Will Campbell and Donovan Jackson. Right around that 32.5 for interior reach. And I get it, some people just want to do kind of chasing extremes, the longest wingspan, tallest tackle, the biggest hands, the heaviest player. But in a high-stakes space between snap and strike, what really actually matters is how efficiently a lineman's upper body delivers controlled violence and their ability to balance with their lower body and get them in position. That's the model, guys. Now, if you're having trouble, visualizing or understanding the whole shoulder width to arm length, creating, a base for what is this person's actual, anterior reach. Take 2 broomsticks, hold them in each hand, right? Let's say the broomsticks are your arm length, right? Now they're identical, right? They're both the same broomstick, both same length, the broomsticks. You have them in each hand, right? And then the distance between them that you're holding them would be essentially the athlete's shoulder width, how broad their shoulders are. Now let's start with maybe 12 inches apart, and you have both tips of the broomsticks put together. And that you're going to try to hit a target out in front of you with those broomsticks. Then you try to hit with your hands 24 inches apart. So widen out your hands, but the tips are still touching, right? Which position lets you reach farther out in front of you? Well, the answer is obviously narrow grip. That's because when your hands are closer together, the broomsticks move forward, extending your reach. But when your hands are farther apart, the broomsticks move more sideways, spreading your effort laterally rather than just projecting it forward, right? This is what can happen with offensive tackles. The arm length is the broomstick itself, the shoulder width is where you're gripping it, and a narrow width, like Will Campbell's, lets you punch forward directly towards the defender's chest, while a wide shoulder width, like Kelvin Banks Jr. in this case, pulls the arms outward, decreasing the forward distance you can travel, and then dulls the strike. Even if both players have the same broomstick, arm length, the one with the narrow grip has a cleaner, longer, more forceful reach. That's the physics of Campbell's advantage in this case. Simple leverage with better mechanics. You can also talk about the force impact kind of like a swing set. You're swinging on a swing step. So let's say one swing has the chairs anchored narrower together at the top, right? The chains are on the crossbar, crossbeam. They're narrow at the top. And the other swing has the chains anchored much wider apart, right? Maybe attached to the seat anchor next to them. So much wider. Now what happens on a narrow anchored swing, your body stays centered and your motion feels more vertical and powerful. You go higher, faster, and your momentum is clean. Now on a wider anchored swing, your body sways more side to side, your motion's less focused, and it takes more effort to go as high. You lose energy laterally instead of channeling it in a forward motion. This is what can happen when a tackle who has those really wide shoulders, the wider the base, the more punch has to be spread laterally as they're coming in towards their target, rather than projecting straight forward with a narrow. Even with longer arms, the broader anchor point causes a loss of direct forward energy, like the swing spreading its force sideways. Now, while Campbell's tighter shoulder width acts like the narrow swing, a clean, powerful, and directly forward, that's something to make note of. And that's why Will Campbell has the best punch in the draft. It's clean, powerful, and gets there on time. And it's not converging. It's direct. The point of contact on 2-point punches or strike point is typically aimed at the breastplate or sternum area of the defender's chest, ideally between the numbers, right? This spot allows the lineman to deliver maximum power while maintaining balance and leverage, and it gives them best chance to control the defender's movement without overextending. Straight on strike equals maximum force and control. When an offensive lineman delivers a two-hand punch, the ideal motion is linear, straight on, coming from a narrow point, both hands traveling directly forward into the defender's chest. the strike point. Again, this allows for full extension of the arms, maximum power transfer, balanced base and centered mass, optimum controlling another person. But when a lineman has those wide shoulders and the geometry of his punches changes, even with longer arms, his hands naturally approach the defender from a wider angle, reduces forward force, opens his frame, it dilutes the punch accuracy, and delays peak force. The hands converge later than ideal. So yes, shoulder width acts like the base of the triangle. When the base is too wide for the arm length, we have to come inward at the angle. This reduces the direct linear projection of the strike, weakening it, especially at high speed. So yeah, it's just a much more ideal triangle for Will Campbell. Yeah, and we know he doesn't have long arms, but he does have the most biomechanically efficient forward reach of any lineman in this draft that I've found. The math confirms it, the tape confirms it, and the league soon will learn that, hey, Campbell's geometry is essentially the reason why he can unlock his superpower punch, which again, if you watch him, he definitely has the best punch in the draft. It's what he's known for. And also note that some guys who have those longer arms but broader shoulders have reduced frontal reach, which projects them more to the inside. You're hyper-focusing on Will Campbell, but you're also neglecting the other guys that actually, in terms of length, and proportions, and ratios, and geometry, are worse off than Campbell. And you're like, oh, that doesn't matter, that's just nerd stuff. No, football's physics. Football is physics. It's all physics. When it comes down to it, I mean, your strategy for handling the physics, yeah, that's where you can get creative. But ultimately, out on the field, the numbers, the physics actually do matter. Just don't let emotions get in the way of that. So now that you've gotten to the end of all this, great. I want you to take a look below in the comments and see how many people will comment about Will Campbell and the outliers and the T-Rex and how the Patriots should have drafted somebody else or should be drafting somebody else. It just shows you how strong their anchor bias is because they've already gone down the road too far. They know they're down the, like, he's a T-Rex, he's an outlier, he's a this, and I get it. And it's true, actually. You could say he is an outlier in many ways. That's, of course, we're accepting that. But you're not looking at that, you're seeing the outlier part as the negative. In some cases, there's actually a positive to it. And I'm not saying everything about his wingspan being narrow was great. Of course not. There are downsides to that. But you're also not looking at the fact that what he's really good at is probably because of his shoulders and how he is built. But for those of you who are not in favor of Will Campbell, but are willing to learn about him, maybe you have a better understanding of arm length and wingspan measurements, and that they're not the whole model to determine if an offensive tackle can play in the NFL. These are inputs to a much more complex model. It's more complex than just the arms outstretched in front of an athlete, and you just turn the switch on for electric football board. And that's it. No, it's not that. My point of these videos on Will Campbell is hopefully to provide you with some information so you can have a bit more flexibility in your analysis and just less biased and cemented and be, I guess, less emotional and combative about it. And I'm not just sitting here just constantly trying to defend Will Campbell because he's like my guy. I've wanted Abdul Carter since April 7th of 2024 for the Patriots in this draft. But I have to accept that he's probably going in the top 3, and he's got some injury concerns, and there's some character concerns apparently. But am I just going to dig my feet in and hate on any other viable prospect? Absolutely not. The Patriots need help almost everywhere, and there's also new coaching staff coming in. So I have to see all the possibilities throughout free agency and the draft. You have to accept that. There are plenty of guys in the first round that can be upgrades on this roster. Now, of course, you have to throw in some like positional value, salary cap projections, and a variety of other variables to determine who's probably the better pick or the smarter pick or more logical pick. But even if it's not one of the more like logical or smart or obvious picks, that doesn't mean they're the worst pick in the top 10. In terms of the players, again, profile and position, there's a whole chunk of guys in the middle of the first round. They're essentially, their composite scores are essentially the same. They're pretty close. So if they move back or they stick where they are and they pick somebody that might be 10th or 15th on another board, I'm just letting you know there's very little difference outside the top 2. Like in terms of metrics, big boards. Not like, oh, draft. I'm talking like how good the players are It really is kind of like a 1-2, and then there's just a big chunk right there that takes up the majority of the first round, and it's just pick the guy you like or the position you need, right? Or positional value. There might be something that really like pushes it over, and it's not necessarily going to be because this guy versus that guy. It's just what they want this year in this draft. So I encourage you to be open to the pick, listen to others, and hope the player they actually take in that first round and every round after is a fit into the culture. They do work out, they stay healthy, and everything's great. Help them out coming in, not by hating them just because they're quote-unquote not your guy. I definitely believe Will Campbell and just about everybody else in the first round deserves that. Anyway, what do you guys think? Does this change your view in any way? Do you disagree? Type in your model in the comment section below. If you guys like this content, please like and subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching.